journalist, newspaper, columnist, media intellectual, lawyer, and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Faculty of Arts, University of Lagos in 1992, and in a Master's in Political Science from University of Ibadan in 1995. In 2010, Adedayo completed and was awarded a PhD in Political Communication by Department of Political Science, still University of Ibadan. In 2017, he graduated with a LLB from the Faculty of Law from the University of Ibadan and was called to the Nigerian bar in 2019. Adedayo worked as senior writer, political desk, and future editor of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper, and left the newspaper in 2003 as deputy editor and editorial page editor. He was also chairman editorial board of the defunct National Life newspaper. He began writing a weekly column for Sunday Tribune in 1998. His weekly intervention on issues of contemporary society received syndication in Cable Nigeria, Premium Times, and in many other online media outlets. He will be presenting a paper on Between Ayinla and Barrister, Conflicting Notion of Superstardom in Fuji and Apala. Over to you, sir. 20 minutes.
Okay.
No, 15, please, because we've lost time.
Okay.
Or maybe 30 minutes, please. I'm sorry for that last because of time. Please, thanks.
Okay. Good afternoon, colleagues. My presentation, as she has already indicated, is entitled Between Ayinla Omowura and Ayinde Barrister, Conflicting Notions of Superstardom in Fuji and Akpala Music. I'm going to be skipping so many prologues, so to speak, that I wrote here. You'll be wondering who Ayinde Barrister and Ayinla Omowura were. They were two Nigerian superstars who sang two different traditional African genres of music called Akpala and Fuji, respectively. And they attained some measure of stardom or superstardom in their respective genres among the Yoruba people. Omowura, Ayinla Omowura, was arguably one of the foremost and most original musicians to sing in indigenous musical, to sing the indigenous musical genre of Akpala in Yoruba land. While Barrister, who also pioneered the genre of indigenous local music, he labeled Fuji, shared stardom with Omowura about the same time. Omowura was Bohemian, was profound, and it is said about him that he was unarguably one of the most original Yoruba musicians of post-colonial Nigeria. He was highly talented, and his period of stardom spanned 1970 to 1980. 1970 to 1980 was a period when, a period of oil boom in Nigeria, where, musicians tried to also take a slice, a bite of the Nigerian boom. And so there was a rise in popular culture, the music of the period, with musicians, seizing stardom and becoming relevant in the scheme of things in society. Omowura, in his music, deployed dense imageries, allusions, proverbs, and wise sayings to construct imageries of society. He was a philosopher in his own right and sang to denounce some of the social evils in society. He had what I call a talismanic hold on superstardom. He had an awesome talent as well. Between 1970 and 1980, he released over 20 albums. And it was a major force to reckon with in the popular music of the time. Sikiru Ayinde Barrister was also a musician who, in his own right, as I said earlier, he created the Fuji genre of music, and also, was a superstar of the period who was reckoned with. However, while both of them contributed immensely to popular music and traditional culture in the southwestern part of Nigeria at the time, there were scholarly arguments about the comparative weights of their individual stardom. While they were alive, that engagement began, and 40 and 12 years after their departures, Ayinla Omowura was killed in a barroom brawl in 1980, while Ayinde Barrister died in 2010. The arguments still endure on who out of them had a greater hold on their genres of popular culture. So how did this come about? In this paper, I tried to trace the origin of the conflicting narratives of their superstardom. And I said that in 1979, in a song that Ayinla Omowura entitled Omititun, volume 17, he actually provoked that supremacy battle between the two of them by alleging that Ayinde Barrister had alleged that he was he plagiarized his song, and so he sang to denounce it in a very. By the way, Ayinla Omowura was a very caustic-tongued musician. He was a diffident character. Some people said he was a man who abhorred anybody sharing stardom with him. And in that song, which I'll try to recreate, he sang, and I'm singing now. He said, Àyìndé má jẹ́ kí n gbọ́ pé mo jí ẹ lórin lò, kò jẹ́jẹ́ bẹ́ẹ̀ ọ̀rọ̀ apárá ni. Ẹ má dẹ̀ máa gbéra ṣánlẹ̀ níwájú irú wa, tó bá ṣe pé ẹ gbéraga ní ìbásàn. À ń rọ́jú jẹ̀kọ ọ̀bùn lọ́wọ́, ọ̀bùn lòun ṣe fújì ní ìgboro, ó ń fọwọ́ yọkun òkúta ń bọ̀. Ẹ̀yin kò mọ̀ pé ká tó pẹlẹ́dẹ̀ ẹsẹ̀ á pé, ká tó pajẹ́ ẹsẹ̀ àpẹ́gbẹ̀ tandán, ẹni bá fẹ́ wọlé odò aṣòtútù. Let me try to translate it. He said, Ayinde, perish the thought that I stole a line of your song. The allegation cannot be so. It smacks of more of a huge joke. Don't in a furtive manner pump up a non-existing ego before a musician like me. If you really want to articulate your supremacy over me, say so for the world to hear. I merely honored you by taking a sip of what belongs to you, just like sharing a bite from a filthy character. And the filthy Fuji musician now announces his worth and supremacy to the world by reason of my condescension. Don't you know that music is like a coven, and anyone who desires to share superstardom with us will be made to do some sacrificial offering. Ayinde Barrister, Ayinde, perish the thought that I stole a line of your song. Then he went here to say, ó fẹ́ jẹ́ sódà nílé orin. Ayinde, ó fẹ́ jẹ́ sódà nílé orin, ohun tẹ́nì kọ̀ọ̀kan fìjẹ láyé. Ẹni tó yó tó ń pánú ẹ̀ nílé orin, ẹni tí ò yó lòun ò yọkùn, lòun ò rankùn, níṣojú ọ̀jọ̀gbọ́n ṣe lómi abẹ́. Translated, he said, Ayinde, you really want to commit suicide in superstardom. You want to swallow the acidic liquid of a soap. It's a deadly poison that no human being who value their existence will ever contemplate. It's comparable to someone reaching beyond their reach. The end result will be cataclysmic. Of course, Ayinde Barrister replied it. And I reasoned, I submitted that the response was very tepid. Some said it was diplomatic. Some said it was mature. But he said that, sorry, I'm not a barrister person like Prof.
That's
So
why.
I won't be able to.
No worries.
So he said there was an Apala musician who they said sang about me. He said, well, there are so many Ayinde barristers, and there are so many Ayindes, so I wouldn't know the Ayinde that he was making reference to. It's certainly not my own Ayinde. It's certainly not my Ayinde. And so the battle began. In my paper, I now tried to find, of course, I was able to decipher where this battle began from. Ayinde Barrister at some point was the captain of Ayinla Omowura's fans club. And so in some way, it is said that that is is a measurement of submission, of supremacy of Ayinla Omowura and his superstardom. Of course, as I said, Ayinla Omowura was acutely jealous and he abhorred rivalry. In one of his songs, he said, Olórin tó bá fojú dì mí lóde, Olórin tó bá fojú dì mí lóde, jíjẹ mímu ẹ̀tàn lé ayé. Meaning that any musician who attempted to spar with him on the superstardom stage, whatever, was prepared to take their leave off this world. Sorry, I'm trying to skip so many things. I have a few minutes left. So people ask, what is the stature of the comparison of their stardom? I mean, why delve into that comparison? The first is that I submitted here that war among superstars in Yoruba land had always been part and parcel of African traditional music. As I talked about how Yusuf Olatunji, Esaka Baba Waidi were always warring, and how Haruna Ishola and Kasumu Adio were also warring, not minding the genres of their songs. For instance, you had Ekpo Akara, who sang Awurebe, always at war with Ayinla Omowura, who was, of the Apala genre. I also submitted that the fact that Ayinde Barrister used to lap up many of the songs of Ayinla Omowura after his demise. One of them is this particular song where he sang about what's that song now? About Eyele Onfolo Odele Ajikogba Ede Ayinla ti Gborin Sikun Oto Dariwale, something like that. Was also an indication that song was an Ayinla Omowura song. And in this paper, I went on to submit that indeed, if you need to compare the weight of their stardom, Ayinla Omowura was far ahead of Ayinde Barrister, and that if Ayinla Omowura had not died, had not been killed in 1980, it would have eclipsed the stardom of Ayinde Barrister. That, in essence, is the summary of my submission. Thank you.
Thank you so much for keeping to time. I know you have so much to say, and if you want to know more about his work, he's the author of a book on Ayinla Omowura titled Ayinla Omowura, Life and Times of an Apala Legend. The next presenter is Saeed Adenrito. He's a professor of history and African diaspora studies at Florida International University, and is also the founding president of the Legal Studies Association. Between March 2020 and July 2022, he has spent 13 months in Nigeria conducting research on his book and a documentary project on Fuji and African popular culture. His presentation today is part of his book-length research on the history of Fuji. His paper is titled Musicians Should Avoid Partisan Politics, Sikiru Ayinde Barrister and Political Fuji, 1980 to 2010. Over to you, sir. You have 12 minutes.
I will try. It's not more. Okay, before I start, I would like to comment that Dr. Adedayo, who is a journalist and the author of the book on Ayinla Omowura, caused a big controversy in Nigeria. Was that 2 years ago? And the crowd of Barrister actually went after me. And for me, it's one of those periods when we are public intellectuals like him having difficult conversation about the turning point in popular culture. It's a big argument that if the Fuji artist, the creator of the genre that I studied, if the creator of the genre that he studied did not die in 1980, the creator of the genre that I studied wouldn't have been in the stadium. And it's a contested narrative. That's one of the reasons I involved him in this. And I just basically called him and said, it should be at ESA in Philadelphia. Let us have this very important conversation about. So I would like to say that this presentation is part of a broader project. It's actually a chapter in my current project of Fuji. And just 2 days ago, I got the approval from University of Chicago Press. We showed interest in this volume. I just have to try to finish it if I can. So basically, we keep the walk on this one.
Maybe the battle for supremacy.
Late one guy in 1980, the other guy, then their spirits are just always around. Honest. Let's say it goes. And the two communities are actually also on this. They're watching this live stream now, so they're probably going to get out. So I would like to. You can just press. It's not going to work with this. Just press the next slide. Yeah, okay, we can do that. Okay. Is it? Yeah. Yes. Okay, good. Oh, good. I will start with a quote, a newspaper quote. Described as a deep support of the military regime on the onset of the Second Republic, but this was rather finished against a lot of problems going on with British colonial with the military rule. He asked politicians not to be disciplined. At that point in time, a lot of people thought that he was just making noise. Some people actually thought it was a partisan artist, and but Barrister continued to advocate for better life for people. And Barrister was actually Barrister did not like the position of the politicians, the second point politician, 1979 and 1983. And he believed that they were recklessly managing the economy of the country to the point that then the intervention of the military. So this quote is from the Lagos Weekend, one of the leading newspapers in Nigeria. That was shortly after the military took over government in 1984. And on December 9th, on December 1st, 1981, General Mohammed Buhari, who is currently the president of Nigeria, led the military coup that took over the civilian government in December 1980. And so shortly after that particular coup, Barrister released an album appropriately titled Military. That was the title of the album. And I think that in the analysis of the sartorial splendor of this album, the sleeve, the cover of the album should be the beginning of a critical conversation about the role that musicians or acts played in popular culture. As you can see in the image, he was standing in a kind of a military position. He was wearing khaki. Khaki was this uniform associated first with colonial military formation, and later after colonialism, Nigerian post-colonial military institutions began to wear it. And this is the album he first produced. In this album, he was basically advocating for a better political governance. He thought that the civilians should be responsible, and he said that, hopefully the next dispensation is not going to be, it's going to be violent free. But Barrister was not just performing or reproducing or impersonating the paraphernalia of military protocol. He was also legitimizing it. He legitimized, he supported the military because he thought that civilians messed up the country. That was the Second Republic. Corruption, exploitation, political violence was as elaborate as it used to be in the First Republic between 1960 and 1961. And for me, the poetics of this album actually talks about the gendering of post-colonial Nigerian state, and it was performing some kinds of diverse forms of masculinities. It was performing a military masculinity over the civilian masculinity. And the way it was performing was with his body, wearing the khaki, and instead of the agbada is this robe that civilians would wear. A few artists of that period had what it takes to actually speak to the question of post-colonial violence at this point in time, because he served in the Nigerian military between 1967 and 1976, about 9 years, and he fought in the Nigerian Civil War. So he was a Civil War veteran, and he could understand. That was the argument I'm trying to make. I think he understands the military psyche. He could speak effectively to how the military was treated in terms of power and authority. But beyond this, I'm also very interested in the ways in which the Lagos weekend actually introduced new ways of thinking about the politics of supremacy within the figurative Fuji kingdom, because it is not called the harbor, Fuji. Like, Barrister is not just speaking to the public politics of military rule. He was also announcing himself as the head of the figurative empire, and that way it created new tension within the Fuji art. Even though a lot of ways contested the whole claim that he invented this genre. So we see a lot of ways in which Harpo was speaking to public politics of underdevelopment, post-colonialism, and military autocracy, or even civilian back rule of civilians. At the same time, it speaks to the politics of supremacy within the Fuji artists themselves. I think that we should have a little bit of conversations about the literature of protest art, protest music. One of the arguments I made in this chapter of the book is that there's a way through which most scholars don't think that musicians, that is, whose art can actually be revolutionaries. But Barrister called himself a revolutionary, and that was why I allowed you to speak at the beginning of this presentation. Most people believe that musicians cannot have political ideology. So in this chapter, I'm trying to contest what constitutes political ideology within the context of the Cold War, because the politics in Nigeria in the 1980s and 1960s and 70s ran directly to what we know about the Cold War, right? The military rule cannot be understood as a context of Cold War, not only in Africa, but across the world. So I'm asking for a kind of a Fuji-centered interpretation of what constitutes ideology. I'm asking us to rethink the circumstances under which an artist who gets paid to sing about people can actually have an ideology. Because the assumption is that only artists like Ella would have political ideology because it's not a patriotic artist. Under what circumstances can an artist who depends on currency for his own survival have an ideology? How do we begin to design and conceptualize political ideology within the context of a uniquely Yoruba-centered proto-nationalism of the 1980s. And how does this connect to the question of Pan-Nigeriana? In this album, Barrister began or started singing in Hausa. He was singing in Hausa now to create a pan-Yoruba ideology, not only for his art as a Yoruba artist, but also for the message. And the message is very, very, incredible. He was speaking to the question of class. God is bigger than the rich people. The rich people are bigger than the poor are bigger than the mass. He was creating a language of class hierarchy that you find in the works of Fela Kuti. So the point I'm trying to make within the context of the literature is that we need to begin to disaggregate or problematize what constitutes political ideology. I think that's 5 more minutes. Okay, I think so. So that's I will. So I'm trying to track the transformation of Barrister's political Fuji. From the 1980s, he was part of the military. In the 1990s, he was against the military. In the 2000s, he became a partisan judiciary. What does it really mean for an artist to transform from in this way? And what does this transformation mean for the history of Yoruba, for history of Nigeria, and for Nigerian political history? But because of time, I will just fly through most of this thing. Politics and arts are intertwined in Yoruba popular culture, historically, satires, even before Fuji emerged, and even before Apala emerged. So what I'm trying to do is to explain what happened with political arts under Fuji from the late 1970s. And I'm trying to understand it within the context of established ways, established arts, satire arts in Yoruba land. And the reason is simple. It's also because of the fact that, as we see in other cultures, arts have poetic license. Now, we over here. If I have time, I will go deep into that. And I think I've given a lot of, because of time, I would like to play a couple of few songs, but this is pretty, then we can. So when the Second Republic began in 1979 and then 1983, and that's when the problem began. Artists are free to sing, and they sing about things associated with their patron. So if you invite Barrister to an artist, he sings about the political party of that patron. If you invite him to another party, he sings about the same patron. So at the point in time, can you go down? Can you go down? I think there was where are we? Yeah, go back. Down. Okay. So down. Yeah. I think what to do is nonetheless, it was beginning to have problems with politicians from 1980 and that range. The reason is because he would say whatever his patrons would give. And the tension was between the regional political party called UPN and NPM, which was the National Party. At the point in time, it was accused of supporting the National Party, NPN, against the UPN. And that is not what was happening to Yoruba Act, because the southwestern part of Yoruba land was under the UPN. And rumors emerged that he had been banned from singing in Yoruba states. So the point I'm trying to make here is that our national politics of the Second World War introduced new dimensions to political acts, because this kind of political situation would not have happened before this era. Partisan politics transformed Fuji in ways that communicate what does it really mean to have an ideology. And those who believe that Fujicians cannot have ideology were arguing within the context of the frequent transformation, or the frequent ways that Fujicians think about different things and different people. I'll just run so that I don't take much time. Go to the next one. Next slide. Okay, good. Sorry. Okay. So this is the same, returning to the same album that I was going to talk. So in this album, which I'm just going to end there because of time. What is interesting again here is at the beginning, he was using his art to promote politicians between 1979 and 1983. But immediately the military took over in 1983, he released this album in 1984. He switched his allegiance to the military. He believed that the military was more disciplined than the civilians. And that's what you see in this book. We let them know that the good governance done to the military. But what is fascinating for me is how he was willing to revise his position on even the most controversial developments in Nigerian history from one period to another. And that's what's very, the idea for this chapter is still evolving. And that's why I would welcome your contribution to this short presentation. I would like to take the time of everyone.
Thank you very much, sir, for that wonderful presentation. One of the joys of being a chair is you get to tell your mentor they've exceeded the time for their presentation. Power to the women. Yeah, the next presenter is Stephen Boluaduro. Stephen Boluaduro is a graduate student in African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His interest basically is to understand how different ideology and aesthetic composition shape Fuji performance across the generational divide. He is also interested in the manner in which these generational ideologies and aesthetics engender and change in Yoruba art form. Ultimately, he's curious about how profoundly the generations of Fuji musicians engage sociocultural repertories to produce social context and realities through overlapping musical aesthetics and performance and compositional art. Part of this study has appeared in Musiki, Journal of Music Research in Africa, Matatu, and Journal of African Cultural Studies. It's presenting a paper titled Negotiating Body, Sex, and Self-Fashioning in Fuji Performance. Over to you. You have 12 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. Sexuality and body are intricately connected to everyday social practice. But the tension between the expression of body and autonomy and normative perception of social expression has begun to generate debate on what is forbidden and acceptable, sacred, secular, decent, and indecent, and other sexual binaries. My intention in this study is to see how expressive culture like Fuji can help in attempt to deconstruct and bridge this tension. Okay, I have a great body of literature on language, music, and sexuality. And some of the findings I got here is verbalization of desire and sexuality are often repressed by social structure. The normative perception on sexuality are often shaped through sonic production on sexuality deployed in popular culture. Then sexual discourse in popular music can unfold a template of contestation of normative perception. I will be so this study privileges sexual scripting framework and Hakim erotic capital. Sexual scripting deals with how pattern of sexual conversation are mapped. Here we don't have, there is no biological constituent in this framework. Rather, what is centered is around social imports that inform multiple interpretations that are ascribed to genetic expression like sexual urge. Sexual scripting theory privileges three different concentrations, which interpersonal, personal, and cultural context. But for this study, we'll essentially look at how analysis of how this study will engage cultural context and how it constructs cultural narrative around sexuality and society, and how this shape interpersonal sexual scripting. Okay, so my focus here have three basic arguments in this study: that sexualized Fuji content contests silence and sexuality. It recreates identity and prefigure a new dispensation of sexual expression. So the boundary between sacred and sexuality in Yoruba culture is clearly defined, and this has mostly been tied to ritual and play, temporality and space, as well as around explosive and expansive. Interestingly, one connecting mechanism to this study is linguistic transition. And language is a powerful resource for cultural transformation. Its flexibility reinforces and ruptures the binary of exclusiveness and expansiveness, depending on how it is enforced in sexual discourse. And this brings us to Obesere, who is the case study for this study. Basically, we're looking at how Fuji artist uses language to construct the universe, and how this help to look at the to push back on issue of sexuality and body autonomy. Obesere, for instance, uses language aid to construct culture with Asha. So Obesere analysis in Excerpt 1, we see how Obesere analysis his premeditated paradigm shift from normative perception of sexual norms in the public domain to an alternative reconfiguration of new sexual scripting that privileges sexuality as well as rearticulation of sexual desire by declaring himself as the king of counterculture, Oba Ashakasha, and mapping out uncommon interactive space for sacred text and secular art, here for grand Obesere intentional disruption of normative convention. You can see that that if the clergy socialize people on religion tenets, but I, the king of Ashakasha, socialize you on what it means as counter culture. So this disruption is articulated by interlocking the religious space of safety with human sexual desire in everyday life. This is articulated through biblicized and proverbial text in a paradise context, as we have seen here. So Obesere deliberately rupture this binary. So he's aware of what it is sacred and what is secular. And his intention is to rupture, to disrupt this binary and blow it. And as we have seen here, he said, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not." Okay. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want a light-skinned girl. So in this case, you see these two different entities being ruptured. Okay. Apart from objectifying human body in expressing desire, the above excerpt reiterates the artistic understanding of the demarcation between the sacred and secular in a context, in a complex layering of religious and cultural imagination to enact his own subverted and vulgarized art to push back on normative cultural boundary and social structure. So, apart from looking at the boundary between sacred and secularity, Obesere also goes on to construct identity using this using linguistics formation. Obesere music artistry deploys certain linguistic formation and content, including metaphor, parody, code switching, post-proverbials, to contest the boundary of sacredness and push back on normative silence on sexuality in the public space. For instance, in OBTK 1, the artist interlock metaphorical description of body, women, and mobility to express social relationship as well as sexual desire in a decomposed but unrestricted voice. Okay, so basically we look at how language is deployed as a catalyst to disrupt the binary between secular and sacrality. In 2002, Obesere, some of the Obesere record was sanctioned or censored by Nigerian Broadcasting Commission because of overt sexual content. And 20 years after this censorship, reflecting on the contemporary Nigerian music, we don't have an index to measure what impact that music content of this nature has upon society. But what we do know is that looking at the contemporary hip hop production artistries, we can assume or we can lay claim that part of this production, music production, Obesere production, Sanjanent, and all of them, directly or indirectly, has some impact on the new generation of artists that we have in Nigeria nowadays. Then apart from this, sort of the way we can also look at this impact on the society is the kind of endorsement that Obesere, for instance, got from some of these herbal company, herbal solutions, aphrodisiac products. So this, in a way, gives us an insight, the kind of impact that this his artistry has on the society. From this standpoint, the process of sexualization of popular culture attempts to strengthen not only conversation on sexuality, but also the sexual health, sexual narrative, health behaviors, which are equally be suppressed and unverbalized because of fear and lack of agency. To recap on this, exploring sexuality through the performance of rupturing sacred and secular opens possibility for self-reclamation of sexuality and body autonomy. It expands Fuji's spatial boundary by contesting silence on sexuality, recreating multiple identities, and prefigured a new dispensation of sexual expression and human desire. This process gives the audience a sense of ownership of the cultural and sexual imagination and desire. By and large, this study affirms the engagement of sexual lyrical content as constitutive a site in which the body is negotiated as a catalyst for sodomy in the contemporary air theory and Pandora musical evocation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. From Fuji, supremacy battles to questions of erotics, and then the final presenter will be Oladele Ayorinde, who will be presenting on Anje Barrister and this complex whole called Fuji. Note on genre making and agency in African popular music. Over to you, Ayorinde.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Oladele. Okay, can we share a slide, please? I'm Oladele Ayorinde from University of Indiana, Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. I'm a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. So I'm going to start my presentation with a very short anecdote. It was on it's 7 a.m. on Saturday, May 5th, 2001, at somewhere called Agege. It was a Fuji rehearsal, it was a rehearsal. And as the music was going on, the band leader, who is known as Egbon Eluku, as we call him Brother Eluku, kept telling the keyboardist, Ogbeni, he was singing, he was also contending with the keyboard player. And as he was saying that, he was telling his manager, Shakiru, so to cut a long story short, the Ogbeni in this picture, I am the Ogbeni in that picture. It was my first Fuji gig. At the time, I was a music student at the College of Education in Janiki. I'm a classical music, I'm trained classically, but at the time I needed to make some money, side gig. And a friend of friends of friends introduced me to this brother. So after the show, to cut the long story short, what I would later understand as the complexity of Fuji during my research was actually established like 20 years ago. And for like 10 years, I worked with different Fuji musicians, including mega stars that we know today. Yeah, and in recent, and during my research again, the last 7 to 8 years, I've gone back to the industry, also producing and even organizing international tours for mega stars. Yeah, so, and that brings me back to for slide 1, please, my presentation today. So this is a chapter in my ongoing monograph on Fuji. So I'm writing a monograph on Fuji. Perhaps this is my official announcement. So on Fuji, and this is one of the chapters where I am negotiating the idea of agency and genre making in post-colonial Africa. So my idea is simply to explore ways in which the agency, the notion of agency in the African context and genre making shapes everyday life in post-colonial Africa. So my work is steeped in the idea of music and political economy of everyday life in post-colonial Africa. And this is just a short excerpt from a particular chapter in my ongoing work. So I'm going to start with the next slide, please. And here I'm focusing on Barrister itself, who has been, I can see the spirit of Barrister is actually live and others in this room actually, which is quite interesting. Yeah. So I'm going to start with, okay, I will just read. In 1979, after many years of contending and trying to negotiate himself within the Nigeria's entertainment industry, after accumulating series of ideas from people borrowing from the high life and jazz scene of the 1970s in Lagos, Barrister finally defined his genre. And I'm going to quote now from his album in 1978 called Fuji Reggae 2. So in that album, Barrister asked a rhetoric question, asking, ladies and gentlemen, who can tell me the meaning of Fuji sound? And he went further to explain, and he said, Fuji sound is a combination of music consisting of sakara, akmala, juju, afro, gudu gudu, aro, and possibly highlife. Yeah. So the Barrister's Fuji definition, to which I will return later, provides an interesting case to understand the politics and complexities around genre making in post-colonial Africa. And before going back to Barrister, I quickly want to explore idea of genre making and perhaps to discuss the intersection of genre making, the genre itself, and the idea of agency. My conception of agency and genre making aligns with Karen Baba's explanation of the term in Yoruba popular culture. In her influential work, The Generation of Plays, Baba affirms that the founder proprietor of any Yoruba popular theater company tells the history of such a company. She argues that such a history indexes the founder's life, whose initiative animates the theater company. This is because theater company embodies the founder's identity and constitute its self-realization as a successful social being. Baba's observation is not only valid for Yoruba traveling theater, but also valid for Yoruba popular music. However, the case that shaped Baba's theorization or explanation is quite different to that of popular music. The theater companies that Baba writes about are branded after the names of their founders. This is not the case in Fuji or other African popular music genres. The relationship between cultural genre, audience, and socioeconomic context within which genres emerge is the shared uniqueness between Baba's conception of genre making in Yoruba theater and genre making in African popular music. The manifestation of this shared uniqueness has been explored by scholars over the years. Also, my conception of the genre relates to Apadurai exploration of teens in his Social Life of Teens, 1986, in a fascinating book. So teens for Apadurai include culture, music, materials, and texts. And they animate and bestow agency on places and people. From an ethnomusicological perspective, before we can understand Fuji and its musicians' agency and how people and place animate genre, we have to explore Fuji sound. This is important because as a teen, to paraphrase Apadurai, the social life of Fuji is inscribed in its trajectories and sounds. I would like to explore this point further. In so doing, I will comment on agency and later return to exploration of genre making in Fuji. Agency now. Are we there? Okay, thank you. In its biggest sense, agency is the act of renegotiating the self through process of reflection and intentional act. In other words, as Patrick Chauvel noted, it involves deliberate acts that seeks to oppose or undermine the constraining pressure which restricts the ability of ordinary people to live, function, work, or play as they fit. This is actually the case for Fuji itself, as I have argued. So, and this actually points to Barrister's enterprise, as well as provide a theoretical underpinning for us to start thinking of the development of Fuji over its 50 years of development. Now, I now return to my brief discussion of Barrister's definition of Fuji. Barrister needed to define Fuji because he felt that the long process of experimentation had reached maturation. Hence, he needed to announce the resultant product of the experimentation process publicly. In the excerpt quoted above, his reference and allusion to each of the parent genres informing the sound of Fuji were followed by a sampling of songs from each of the musicians and genre that he mentioned. He referenced Sakara, Akpala, Juju, and Afrobeat in manner that it did indicate obeisance or patronage or loyalty to his superiors within the music and record industry. Also, any direct acknowledgement of this genre constitutes a strategy. Okay, I mean, also the direct acknowledgement of these genres constitutes a strategic presentation of his voice and the self, and announcing his own place within the trajectory and the music industry. It is another way of asserting his superiority and renegotiating respectability in social scenes in Lagos and beyond. By 1988, 10 years later, Barrister had continuously asserted asserted himself as a cosmopolitan subject. This is evident in the series of albums produced in this period, particularly his Fuji Garbage series. I explored this further. Okay, just play the slide. Yeah, okay, just leave it there. So I would like to dwell a bit on this Fuji Garbage because it's quite important for us to understand the idea, the composite nature of genre making and the idea of agency in African popular music. There is more than meets the eye in Barrister's Fuji sound. Fuji Garbage 1 and 2 reaches the climax of the classic Fuji sound and mark the beginning of the modern Fuji sound. Barrister had recorded Fuji disco in 1980, responding to the domination of American funk and disco in Lagos. And in the 80s, experimented with trumpet and mouth organs, but the brilliant color of the Fuji Garbage series transformed the Fuji music and Fuji musicians' idea of the genre. Building on the previous years of experimentation, Barrister brought in keyboard synthesizers, the Hawaiian guitars, and other form of cosmopolitan musical instrument to portray himself as a global entity, not as a street musician or local champion, as Fuji is known in Nigeria at the time. So it produced a sound. Fuji sound captured the imagination of fantasy. The garbage sound captured the imagination and fantasy of children, young and older people. Fuji Garbage is a concoction of the classic Fuji sound and pastiche of rock, funk, juju, and Afrobeats. So let's just listen to the next one. The YouTube, can you just play? Let's listen to just 2 seconds.
I would kindly ask that you round up 1 minute.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, the next slide, the pictures. Okay, the underlying principle of genre making in Fuji and other popular African forms references what Francis Inyamjo terms incompleteness. The idea of incompleteness brings an African perspective to the long-standing ethnomusicological anthropological discourse on genre making and agency. Incompleteness references lack, which is essential human condition. It animates things, to use a padarized word, as a distributive agency. Fuji musicians and Fuji are permanently in the state of work in progress. They are work in progress because they constantly accumulate new meanings as the social and political context in the society changes. In conclusion, music becomes a lens to understand the manifestation of these processes of agency and genre making, not only in music aesthetics, but also as a lens to understand the everyday political economy and how people negotiate well-being and the body in the post-colony. As the Fuji case shows, genre making in Africa and popular music references the social life of the post-colony. African cities breathe and speak through the everyday aesthetics and sounds that shape their streets, suburbs, and centers. Focusing on the strategies of politics of cultural producers like those of Fuji musicians is crucial for understanding urban centers and cities in Africa. This process of self-making, genre making, and city making follow an unending cycle to understand. And then to understand them, we need to follow them with a microscopic lens, to borrow a time from Clifford Guest. And to do this is to situate them within the changing social and political context of the society. Thank you.
limited time, but I listened to all of the wonderful presentation from male scholars. I was looking at my mentor, Mr. Rico, and then my high focus over to one of the foremost scholar of popular music in Angola, Professor Moman, and I know I'm in good company. So the discussion, we have 10 minutes to discuss the papers, and then we'll open the floor up for questions and answers.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to make some general comments because I know that people in the audience are also anxious to weigh in, and I'm anxious to hear the conversation as well. I'm going to orient my comments sort of in a general sense towards the genre. This is a great set of 4 papers. I want to think about Fuji in a slightly broader context and ask our authors and our creative workers here to account for a little bit of a bigger frame as to why and how we're thinking about Fuji in this particular moment. So let me make a couple of sort of framing comments around this, and then we can throw it open for a broader conversation. A couple of key words that I thought about reading the papers and then thinking through the presentations. First, I want to think about labor. Second, I want to think about stardom, celebrity, fame, renown. All of that is one thing. But let me think about those 2 things in relation to each other, first of all. So I think one of the things about Fuji that's very interesting, that ties into the way that we tend to think about popular music, has to do with its reflexive relationship to labor, to laboring body, to trying to turn labor into some form of value. And I think a number of the papers point to this idea of stardom, celebrity, fame, and the ways in which what a good musician, a good artist does is not just make good music, but reflexively create a framework for making this music valuable, for telling the audience, for telling people how to consume it in certain kinds of ways. I mean, consume both as a form of pleasure as well as a form of commodity formation. But I want us to think about labor. How does labor get transformed and turned into something in the different practical ways that music operates? One of the things that I would love to hear more from all of you is about the changing technologies of music production and consumption and circulation, because we're talking across a really interesting set of decades where that is radically changing. And the artists, the audiences, the journalists, the celebrity columnists, all of the kind of infrastructures around music, the military, are all deeply embedded in the changing technologies of music production, of recording, of electronic music, of then how music is being circulated on albums, on cassettes, on bootlegs, on Bluetooth, in all those various forms, in various traveling musical groups and all of those things. So labor and stardom are these 2 kind of frameworks that I think force us to think about why music becomes popular in performance, in events. Because again, what a good, I think, musician does is not just play great music. A great studio musician may be a great musician, but they may not be a star because they don't know how to put together an event. What a great musician can do is turn that music into something, tells the audience, this right now is really, really, really important, and you're lucky to be here because I'm famous. And you are lucky to be a part of my story. So they create a narrative, they create a story as a performer, and they tell you, you're now in my story, and you should then be part of telling the story moving forward. So creating a genre to me is something really interesting. And I'd love you guys to get a little bit more at that. I love the way you ended with thinking about genre, and all of you touched on that in interesting ways. But genre, again, is not simply about music. It's about a reflexive framing of that music within a specific event. When does an event start? What's the narrative? What's the story in that event? How does an artist try and create themselves as the center? And again, starting with the idea of controversy is brilliant, right? So what a good artist does is put themselves in the center of a controversy, and they're not afraid of that kind of thing. They invite controversy, they invite that kind of thing in their lyrics, maybe using innuendo, using certain kinds of things to draw controversy, or explicitly calling out people, making all sorts of claims in really interesting ways. So controversy being part of that. But again, I keep thinking about labor, and I want to maybe, one way to think about that, if you're interested, is to think about the changing military regime, what is the figure of the zombie, which comes up in Fella and in one of these other tracks as well. What is the ideal laboring subject as regimes change in Nigeria and globally? What does it mean to be a good laboring subject? Does it mean to be a good voting subject? Does it mean to work in a factory? Does it mean to be a good soldier who does what you're told? Or does it mean to be someone who doesn't do what you're told? Does it mean to speak back to power? And how does that shift, or how does that get disciplined through violence or through other forms of innuendo? So what does it mean to be a good laboring subject? How does that get embedded in the music itself? And then what it means to participate in a musical event. And I'm also thinking then of Fela, of course, and the ways in which he becomes this kind of image of a sovereign state in certain ways. And then what does it mean to be a citizen or a subject of these kind of musical states? A couple other questions really for me, the question about spirituality, the question about different forms of reverence around sexuality. But music, to me, I would love to just hear a little bit more if we have time, sits in this really interesting space, using doubleness, using kind of humor, using kind of complicated linguistic frames to think sexually, but also religiously, also spiritually, and drawing on multiple traditions. And that then ties into the question that came up in a number of your papers around the relationship between Western Nigeria, Yoruba spaces and identities, Nigerian identities and Nigerian kind of spaces and navigations, and the different language cultures that might navigate. Because one of the things that we see, I think now with the globalization of Nigerian music, and in the last 20 years, the kind of Afro beats and the hip hop artists, various artists who I see going global, what they've done really well is use pidgin and pidgin hooks and certain kinds of very simplified forms of rhythms, which then speak across and outside of Nigeria. So I'm interested in how you might see this music and the complexity of it. And then now there's a kind of moment of revival of Fuji as well, which is quite interesting. But the last point I want to make on that is, how do we fit this into the context of the globalization of Nigerian music? How does it speak outside of Nigeria versus how it speaks within different audiences in Nigeria? That for me, partly as someone who's written and engaged in Ghana music and African music more globally, is something that I'm really interested in. Why Nigerian music circulates in certain ways, Nigerian music and Ghana music in dialogue, a lot of Nigerian musicians being based in Accra, moving back and forth, and the kind of competition, friendly competition, and sort of borrowings from different musicians and things like that in different audiences. So how does this music work outside of the context in Western Nigeria, outside of Lagos versus, inside? So those are my sort of questions, comments, thoughts. I don't know if you want them to take those on now, or you want to open it up, or how you would like to go from there.
Would it be better to open it up and then have each presenter respond?
I think it would that be the best, because we have another session less after this one.
Yeah.
Maybe we can take questions.
Okay.
And we just complete it.
Yeah.
We don't have time.
Okay. Just wanted to mention that when he was talking about controversy and everyone was talking about supremacy battle, I sort of felt, where the new generation conversation between VII and Davido, who is the biggest artist, and then he mentioned celebrity and all of that. And I thought to give a shameless plug about my panel coming up on African celebrities at LSA 2023. On that note, I will open up the platform for questions. Over there, yeah, we can go in that order, yourself, and then, I'm sorry, I don't know name. You can just begin by introducing yourself and then your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fuji. Currently, I'm a student at Fuji University in the United States. I have 3 questions. I have one for the first presenter. I have one for the second presenter. So my first question for the first presenter is, I know that on the flip side, though, without necessarily, I have the opinion that Anila was far superior for obvious reasons. But I'm just curious that on the flip side of volume 18, Anila made reference to Fuji. And I was wondering why he did that. He sang that Alaja Basira Ayameji, that they go to Fuji. So I'm curious, was that an influence of Marista's music on Anila's music? So that's my question. Then to Prof, you mentioned that Marista changed to a non-Pakistan musician in 1984. But I'm curious because although I can't really say the year he sang Nigeria, but from the content of the song, I think it should be in 1983 when he sang about the election in 1983. Then I know that in that song he said and that was clearly before 1984. So I'm wondering whether he actually stopped in 1984 or he did before 1984. Then my question to the last person is, I'm curious, maybe I didn't really get the point well. You mentioned something about Fuji reading, you said in 1978, but I don't know whether you're trying to say that was when Barista made reference to Fuji or when he announced that he has created Fuji, because I know that way before that, maybe 1974, when he sang I did Jenny Foloni, he made reference to Fuji in that song. So I made a little bit of clarification. Thank you.
Awesome. Can the next person speak? Kindly keep it brief, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so my question is to the last presenter. I really don't talk to the idea of which agency is what for me it's really interesting. But I was wondering to what extent you want to push that frame of thinking, because once you talk about agency, you necessarily have to understand the fact that you can have clean agencies, agency of things, but also have flesh agency, which is the agency of flesh materiality. And that means you might want to center the artist himself as the author of the genre. And so, first question is, to what extent are you willing to link up your idea of the agency of key streets, conception of Fuji? And one of the speakers talk about made massive reference to an artist being like of the genre, right? Without necessarily complicate that kind of decision. So what extent are you willing to drive the logical conclusion of what you're distributing? Because once we begin to talk about it, we're talking about the methodological process. Yeah. So how would you want to partner in the methodological process? The entire production itself does not necessarily give hierarchy of agency. So I was just drawn by that. We want to know how you negotiate.
Okay, awesome. You can go ahead, Professor.
Yeah,
Sure.
So actually, when the last that I was presenting was thankfully so that kind of wrap up all the presentation for me. So and then we are now talking about labor and stadiums. So and I was wondering for all the presenters. So the idea of labor and stadium in Fuji is so interesting. But I want to ask, do you think the idea of democracies in Fuji, we talk about what I see somebody is kind of using charm against the other person. So, and I want to reference the case of Aisha Bello. Aisha Bello was a good Fuji artist, and also but he was not that successful because he had a series of accidents in his career. So then his career went down. Very similarly, you can draw the kind of conclusion of parallel between Shetu and Laokamoko and Ashina Onyarugai Mamuskoda. However, Ashina only started before Shetu, but Shetu today is kind of a global icon. And similarly, I thought about Solitaire Shaw, so who was also a great musician, but also died in his prime. So all of these unfortunate incidents of probably I did kind of the way turn down to the idea of the mathematics for sure in a genre of Fuji, or is it that these artists are so unfortunate and that they lack the necessary empowerment to really be productive in their own Fuji career, or is this really a case of spiritual attack as commonly some of the
Thank you. So we have the presenters respond to the question. But I sort of think that the metaphysics was present in the room right from the beginning when the technology were not working. I'll leave the presenter to speak. You can respond to the question, then we go back to the audience that way back and forth.
Okay. I think because we're running out of time, we only have 10 more minutes. There's another LSA panel immediately after the 10 minutes. So I would like to thank Jesse for that brilliant summation of the presentation. And the whole idea of a turning point in Fuji history is for me the time when we have scholars interested in Fuji. I think that it's a delay for a major Yoruba popular culture that we're just actually thinking about writing books on this subject at this point in time, given the fact that it's the most dominant and the most representative of the Yoruba popular culture even to today. So I won't respond to all the charges and the point because we're going to be here forever. What I would like to say is that all the comments you have made and Justice comment, this tells us that we have a field. And that's the way I'm conceiving Fuji. I'm conceiving it more than book, more than books. So we're talking about a major field, like how Nollywood is now one of the most creative and one of the most transformative fields in African studies really defined. And all the comments that Jesse made about labor, about technology, about consumption, about entrepreneurship, I see that deeply influenced by your work. And actually the making of superstars. What does it really mean to be a superstar? The transformation of that. These are important discursive or conceptual framework that can be critically used to explain what is going on in Fuji. And so in a nutshell, thank you so much for the questions, especially the question about 1983. The album you're talking about was before the 1983 election, and the military, the album I'm talking about, military was after the election. It's a long story that I would like to talk to you. So in a nutshell, thanks to the questions and the comments, solidify what we're trying to do with this panel. And this is not going to be the last one of every LSA panel at ASA from now on. We will be having a panel of Fuji until forever. And that way, we'll be able to collectively create a field that does not exist.
Okay, you can speak next and then.
Okay.
Okay, Mojib was asking about a particular song from Ayinla Omowura, which he thinks underscores the fact that Ayinla Omowura deferred to Barrister in terms of superstardom, the weight of their individual superstardom. Yes, I'm also very curious about it because I remember that in an earlier album, which I think should be about 1975 or 76, Ayinla Omowura sang where he was saying, Fuji to dara, ewa gbolowo egbe wa. So, I mean, that made me to start wondering, was there a conflation of, Fuji and Akpala, or was there a mutual difference to each other by both Ayinla Omowura and Barrister? I think those are issues that we should be interested in pursuing further. Finally, let me make a passing reference to our brother there who was talking about spirituality. I mean, if you read my book on Ayinla Omowura, I said that stardom, I mean, that particular musical stardom was one, it was wardom, so to speak. It was war. There was an enemy lurking somewhere, and they were pursuing the enemy. Each one of them, especially those superstars of the 70s, there was an invisible enemy that must be brought down, either through acidic attacks, of their songs or whatever. And they deployed metaphysical powers. For instance, you remember in Ayinla Omowura, he was singing, said, Gengele Kashagbemi Leke. And even if you also saw the film by Tunde Kelani, you saw where Agbeja Pauba was making incisions on the head of Ayinla Omowura and telling him that, look, we have covered them in a black pot and they can never rise again. There was an enemy, perception of an enemy who must be fought to a standstill.
All right, thank you so much. If you want to know more, I hope you will have your books at LSA 2023 for those who would like to buy. And since my mentor was saying Fuji will be a permanent feature of LSA panel, I was thinking maybe I'll work with Professor Morman. We should have Semba every, so you can respond and then we'll
Okay, thanks so much for the question. First of all, I was making reference to the late 70s because Fuji, in my book and my work, I have conceptualized the idea of incompleteness from the lens of Barrister in ways in which he, as a distributive agency, to borrow terms from Nyamjo and Amos Tutuola, the palm wine drunkard. So Barrister himself, from the onset, Fuji is an incomplete thing. Yeah, it started from somewhere. In fact, it's rooted in pre-1900, the African indigenous culture.
Yes.
Yeah, so then, and again, there's this notion of where is not the foundation of Fuji, please. Yeah, I have discussed that in my work. Fuji actually started in the what is Fuji genre today, started in 1974, 1975, in the recording called Ayinde King. And before Fuji, Barrister only practiced were for 1 year. And because of economic reason, in 1967, Barrister launched himself as a Sakara musician.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a record for this. I even have performance details, pictures for this. He himself, well, that's not it. So the point is that Sakara is the founding father of Fuji. Were is a foundational thread for all Islamic-oriented Yoruba popular music.
Yes.
Sakara emerged from Were, Akpala emerged from Were, but Fuji took another route. Instead of from Were, he moved to Sakara. He practiced Sakara for like 10 years as an established Sakara musician, playing across Lagos, Broad Street, and all the hinterlands of Lagos and Yoruba land. And from there, the Lagos jazz scenes of 1970s, Barrister was so engrossed in that scene, borrowing from jazz artists, competing with them from his sound. And by 1976, 1977, the Festa 77 was very, very powerful, was very, very tense that he had to, other musicians, for instance, other Fuji musicians emerged, and it became uncomfortable for him to carry on with the ideas. So he had to relaunch, to discuss, to make a kind of conceptual and a conscious act to define Fuji through his album. But before then, he has created Fuji not as a kind of urban center, but using juju, using iLife. In fact, on many occasions, he performed with Fela in National Stadium, performed on national TVs, trying to play what they were doing. That was not very, that's Fuji. But the other one about agency. So the idea of agency, like I conceptualize it in my own work as a distributive idea. So it is not a fixed entity. It's a permanent work in progress. And that is the story of Fuji itself. If you check the trajectory of Fuji sound, let's say from Ayinde King in 1973, 1974, down to today, what we have today, and the last record I produced from few weeks ago with Fuji musician in Lagos, the sound has changed, metamorphosed on a rapid scale. People are drawing from every idea. Yeah, let me just give you the last point. So I was in a studio with one of these mega stars also. He was telling me, look, let us do jazz. It's going to sell. Let us do jazz. And this is because I came from South Africa at the time, I was producing him. He told me, look, I'm going to South Africa, they can shame me by now. I told him, look, just tell me what you want, I will do it for you. And I launched with this on the console. Okay, let's do. And that particular idea, he took it to Facebook and started launching it. So that is Fuji for you, and that's who they are. There's a slide I couldn't show. In terms of body fashioning, in terms of sound, in terms of their idea of circulation, production of Fuji, even the market is an incomplete space. Everybody comes in, and out. So that is Fuji for you. We can't even tie it down. And to the last point, sorry, my work is actually about political economy. It's centered in economic ethnomusicology and economic anthropology. So everything you're talking about are things I have laid down in my own work. So I am exploring the production, circulation, spheres of exchange, profit mechanisms, and different forms of ideas that shape fandom, celebrity, and idea of space. I have explored that in my work.
Thank you so much. I will have to use the. Can you say one thing for 1 minute and then a couple of announcements and we'll be done?
Okay, I don't have question, but I think I will talk about the accumulative nature of Fuji, as we were saying. from inception and now, and you see Fuji accumulating varieties of genre of music around you, and that's what Fuji is actually is. Fuji doesn't have a piece component. It takes from different, and apart from the instrument they play, you talk about body fashioning, and you can even see this in Pasuma. Pasuma doesn't really sing much in quote, I'll say, but you see Pasuma recreate himself. He recreates himself often, and this is part of what you see in Fuji. Apart from singing, you see this self-fashioning as part of agency that Fuji uses to recreate itself and prepare.
Thank you so much, panelists, for your wonderful paper. Thank you. Just a couple of announcements. I'd like to encourage you to be part of LSA.